My opponent and I are in agreement that same-sex marriage should be a priority of the movement, but it is essential that we shift the focus from marriage to the Employee Non-Discrimination Act to educate Americans about what it means to be queer and attempt to get a job. My opponent argues that the primary reasons that marriage should be the primary issue of the movement is for two reasons. First, that it has to do with future successes, and second, that it challenges heteronormativity. In terms of future success, my opponent cannot seriously suggest that it is more important for queer people to be able to get married than to be able to get jobs. It is more essential that a queer person be able to hold a steady income than to be able to marry someone to gain more wealth. My opponent also brings up adoption, but even if a queer couple gets married, they still might not be able to adopt, as any couple can be denied the right to adopt, being queer or not. Adoption is irrelevant to this argument. My opponent also argues that we cannot simply switch to discussing the Employment Discrimination Act instead of same-sex marriage, but I see no reason why we cannot discuss both issues but place more emphasis and more money into the Employee Non-Discrimination Act. As I have outlined already, it will not take more time to pass because 9 out of 10 Americans already think that it exists. Next, my opponent argues that same-sex marriage would challenge heteronormativity, but the Employee Non-Discrimination Act would do the exact same thing. My opponent states that marriage already covers trans people and intersex people with loopholes, but he does not elaborate or cite on this point because it is false, and trans people are at an extreme disadvantage in the workplace. American Progress reports that anywhere from 14 to 43% of gender and sexual minorities face discrimination or harassment because of their identities, and that number jumps to 90% referring to just trans people. That same argument states that 20% of trans people have been homeless, and homelessness many transgender people turn to work as a means to survive, raising the chances of being HIV positive. This is literally a life and death matter. Additionally, my opponent argues that language doesn't matter when referring to transphobia, but by simply quoting Judith Butler, he cannot argue that language, which is how all people express their identity, does not matter. And identity is the key to this debate, because without it, there would not even be a queer community. My opponent also states that there is no reason why marriage wouldn't lead to the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, but there's no reason why the Employee Non-Discrimination Act wouldn't lead to marriage. And with the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, queers would have more money to donate to the cause to support it. And in terms of support, my opponent cannot argue that since Obama supports the Employment Discrimination Act, that it will pass, because Obama also supports the repeal of DOMA. In terms of employment, my opponent states that employers will find it harder to fire someone who has a family, but an employer will also find it more hard to fire a queer person if it is illegal to fire them for being trans or a sexual minority. But I would like to turn the discussion of this debate back to the question at hand. Should same-sex marriage be the top priority of the LGBT civil rights movement? And the answer is overwhelmingly no. As I have stated, the Employee Non-Discrimination Act is the most important issue that the queer community should focus on. It also sends a more inclusive message than same-sex marriage, and without it, people's lives are literally at stake. Marriage only affects a small population, and the Employee Non-Discrimination Act affects any queer person who wants to live.